Well, we made it to the third entry in the Stalker series, the final entry until the upcoming release of Stalker 2, which is, by my reckoning, the fourth Stalker game. Finally replaying Call of Prypiat after all these years, I was shocked at how many of my distinct memories of the franchise are entirely from this third game. Call of Prypiat released in October 2009, just 1 year after Clear Sky, and I'm playing the console port that released earlier this year. Call of Prypiat is a direct sequel to the first game, taking place in the months following Strelok's disabling of the monolith, and features 2 new locations closer to the center of the zone, and a bit of rethinking on how the map functions overall. The core gameplay of shooting, scavenging, and surviving is maintained through all the games, but Call of Prypiat has arguably the strongest mechanics to bolster them. Basically everything has been reworked. The A-Life system of Clear Sky has been toned down and used as more of a background accessory than a focus, and consequently the game doesn't have the vaguely Far Cry military shooter feel of Clear Sky. But there are still plenty of odd and interesting situations that can arise from the relative freedom given to the AI. These are often pretty frustrating, like when I was achievement hunting and had to fully restart my game because a quest broke. But it'll always do things you don't quite expect, and there's something to be said for surprise. The survival elements of Shadows of Chernobyl are back and cranked up, with hunger back and boosted into a more consistently pressing issue as it directly affects stamina regeneration and resistance to psychic damage. Artifact hunting has synthesized SOC's respawning artifacts with Clear Sky's more zone-focused artifact mazes, and amplified it through the use of tunnels, verticality, and little puzzles that reward careful navigation, or getting the highest level artifact detector that just marks the dangerous areas for you. The emission system from Clear Sky returns in a somewhat more interesting way, with emissions occurring approximately once per day and having a decent chance of respawning artifacts. Stashes have changed as well in a way I really like. They now spawn in as soon as you boot up the game, and they're no longer randomized, so you are rewarded for carefully exploring areas, unlike the previous iteration of stashes, which was sometimes disappointing since the loot wouldn't spawn in unless you'd already gathered a corresponding note from a corpse. The economy has also been completely reworked in a way that, well, it's odd. Merchants pay quite a bit for artifacts, and if you manage to scavenge any intact weapons, they'll pay decently for those too. And yet I couldn't help but feel that I always had an abundance of money in this one. There's a more intense focus on side quests, and if you play through a decent amount of them and do some sporadic artifact hunting, you'll start randomly upgrading weapons just to get rid of the excess cash. It's one of the few systems in this game that I wasn't really a fan of. The upgrade and repair systems always felt like a bit of a wrong turn compared to the scavenge and abandoned weapon strategy of the first game. It just feels a little too grand for the setting to have these incrementally powerful upgrades on guns that should seemingly be pulled from radioactive waste piles, and to have such skilled technicians willing to venture into the zone, which is essentially a minefield full of horrible monsters. I mean, it just doesn't seem like a good place to be a mechanic. Let's see, what else? Weapon slots were reworked so we can use any weapon in either slot. We've got persistent storage now and can sleep through the night. And every squad you run into can fast travel you across the map for a fee. There's a lot of great quality of life improvements. And there's now in-map caves that aren't locked into distinct zone endpoints, which is quite the surprise the first time you accidentally fall into one. And for that matter, the areas are now aiming at more of a somewhat open world feel, with Call of Prypiat having only 3 play areas that are each large and fairly well packed with landmarks, scavenging points, artifact hunting areas, and tons of mutants. I've always heard the complaint that Call of Prypiat feels empty compared to the other games, and honestly, I don't really see it unless I'm exploring some of the zone edge areas where no quests are set. I think part of this is that the fundamental design philosophy of the maps has been changed to a sort of hub-and-spoke system, where all 3 maps have a centralized town with everything the player needs. It's a big change from the previous entries dotting multiple friendly settlements across the maps, and forcing us to walk between merchants and repairmen, and quest givers. Most of Call of Prypiat's quest givers are located in those central town areas. And beyond that, there are generally less randomized enemy encounters in COP. Oh, and for the console version, they finally added customizable D-pad options, so you can hotkey anti-radiation drugs. Big fan of that change. So how does Call of Prypiat actually feel to play? Well, the shooting is a lot tighter than the previous entries, but you can also get incredibly powerful guns pretty early in the game if you know which stashes to look for, or just stumble into one. There's also a special merchant in the very first camp who can deliver you enhanced versions of endgame equipment for the money equivalent of about an hour's worth of artifact hunting. Probably my biggest complaint is how easily I got top tier equipment that I just never needed to replace. They've kept the weapon and armor upgrade systems in, and they're now locked behind finding specialized toolkits out in the game world. Which was actually a nice change, since it caps the progression of weapons a little, and bleeds some currency from the player. But I still had enough resources, so I did end up fully upgrading a lot of weapons just to try them out, and I rarely felt any pressure to use my resources wisely. Personally, the scarcity of the first game is one of the enduring positive elements that I really associate with the series. Having so much money flowing freely does sort of shatter the illusion of this place being full of scavengers barely scraping by with makeshift and shoddily repaired equipment. And for that matter, unless you really go seeking out fights, you will almost never encounter random human enemies to fight. There's no innately hostile faction in the first two zones, so firefights only really break out in the quest missions, and the rest of the time you're either exploring or fighting mutants. But this game really does a great job of bringing back the dread of Shadows of Chernobyl. Mutants are dangerous again. A pack of dogs can make quick work of the player on higher difficulties. And carrying a backup shotgun is almost essential. The mutants have unique tactics too, with bloodsuckers doing constant hit and runs, or the Psy Dogs returning as regular random enemies. Most of the environmental dread comes down to the graphics and lighting engine. I'm not gonna exaggerate and say I forgot the game came out 15 years ago, but the use of shadow is still pretty impressive, texture quality be damned. And exploring some locations at night is still genuinely creepy. There's also a much better use of sound and music in this one than the prior two. Areas have unobtrusive ambient soundtracks that really set the mood, interwoven with faint scratches and whispering. And when the soundtrack stops, it feels like all hell's holding its breath. Call of Prypiat is a bit different from the first two entries in that we don't actually play as a Stalker. Instead, we play as a Ukrainian secret agent dropped into the zone to investigate the failure of Operation Fairway, an attempt to send a scouting party of helicopters into the zone that failed when they were all mysteriously disabled and crashed throughout the map. We're dumped into the zone with an AK, a Stalker disguise, and a dream. If you beeline straight to the helicopters and just follow the main quest, I think you can complete this game in around 6 hours. But if you take the time to immerse, to explore around for side quests, to hunt artifacts, and double deal with the bandits, you'll be in for something around a 30-hour experience. This game definitely has the best developed side quests of the franchise, and I think it's well worth the time to explore the friendly camps and take on some of those. The main plotline has us visit the locations of the 6 crashed helicopters, which point us towards a rally point the military established in the middle of the zone for the survivors to congregate. We assemble a crack team of vodka-addled psychopaths to reopen an abandoned underground tunnel that leads to Prypiat proper. Once we're in, our agent meets up with the military and, surprise surprise, Strelok. Strelok's big reveal is that the helicopters crashed because anomaly fields change after every emission, rendering the scouted flight paths completely useless. Anyways, we battle with the remnants of Monolith, which have had a sort of religious reckoning since the destruction of the Wish Granter. Without their psychic god entity controlling them, some of the Monolith forces are grappling with free will, and others are building cargo cult effigies trying to bring it back. We destroy a few radio jammers, call in the troops, and we're back in time for breakfast. Or not. We can choose to stay in the zone and keep playing as free roam, but it's not really elaborated on in any way and doesn't act as a functional conclusion to the story. Overall, the story is fine. There's a lot of little things you'll probably miss unless you dig deep into the story and try different solutions on different runs. But for the most part, it's just a sort of serviceable framework to guide the player between the areas. As a whole, the game functions pretty close to a sandbox, and like most sandbox games, the story is a bit perfunctory. Call of Prypiat stands out to me as having some of the most memorable sequences in the series. It modernizes a lot of the annoying issues with the franchise through a really tremendous number of quality of life fixes, and makes the gunplay a lot more streamlined in a way most players really appreciate. The story is a little underfed, but the overall atmosphere is comparable to the first game. I think I really clearly prefer it over Clear Sky, but as far as it measures up against the first game, well, it's close. With this console port, I actually had more hard crashes and bugged out quests than Shadow of Chernobyl, which is an interesting reversal from my first playthroughs a decade or so ago. COP was much smoother than Shadow of Chernobyl at launch, and I pretty distinctly remember having to edit files to fix hard-locked saves in that first game. As is, I'd give the PlayStation port of Call of Prypiat a mildly painful. It's a ton of fun, but still held back by some lingering bugs and a few mechanical elements that seem to contradict the setting. I'd really recommend it as an entry point to the series, due to being a bit more accessible and modernized than the first game. The weirdest thing about the series is that every entry has at least one section that feels really rushed and out of place. There's a ton of articles about various time crunches, and ultimately the game's all released in the span of 3 years, so I believe they were in a hurry. I'm really curious to see what happens with Stalker 2 next month, since GSC has been working on it for quite a while now. Playing the whole series really has gotten me excited, which could be unfortunate. Anticipation is the father of disappointment. Anyways, that's all for my 26th review. Stalker always makes me think about the Metro series, so that might be something I cover next year. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, see ya!
What are you, a statue? If you got something, spill the beans. If not, take a hike.